Paris, France. October 18, 1990, 3:47 in the afternoon. Eli Cohen sat at a small café table on Rue de Rivoli, watching tourists photograph the Louvre across the street. He was supposed to be on vacation, his first real vacation in 3 years. His handler had insisted. Burnout was a real problem in intelligence work, and Eli had been showing signs. The dark circles under his eyes, the weight loss, the way his hands shook slightly when he held his coffee cup. So Mossad had ordered him to take 2 weeks off. Go somewhere, relax, stop thinking about targets and operations and the people who got away. Paris seemed like a good choice. It was beautiful. It was far from the Middle East. It was a place where he could pretend to be a normal person for a little while. He ordered another espresso and watched a street performer juggle fire. The afternoon sun was warm on his face. For the first time in months, he felt something close to peace. And that's when he saw him, walking past the café, maybe 20 meters away, moving through the crowd of tourists with the practiced ease of someone who knew how to blend in. Mahmoud al-Rashid, the Butcher of Beirut, the man Eli Cohen had been hunting for 12 years. Eli's hand froze halfway to his coffee cup. His heart rate spiked so fast he could hear blood pounding in his ears. This wasn't possible. Al-Rashid was supposed to be in Damascus. The last confirmed sighting had been 6 months ago in Syria. Intelligence suggested he never traveled to Western Europe anymore. Too much exposure risk. Too many intelligence services that wanted him dead or captured. But there he was, older than the photographs Eli had memorized. Hair grayer, wearing expensive clothes, designer sunglasses, looking like a successful businessman, rather than one of the most wanted terrorists in the Middle East. He was alone, which was unusual. Al-Rashid typically traveled with security, at least 2 bodyguards, sometimes more. But right now, at this moment, on this Paris street, he was completely vulnerable. Eli forced himself to breathe normally. His training kicked in despite the adrenaline flooding his system. He didn't stare. He didn't move suddenly. He tracked Al-Rashid with peripheral vision while appearing to watch the street performer. Al-Rashid walked with confidence but not hurry. He stopped at a newsstand, purchased a magazine, exchanged a few words with the vendor in what sounded like fluent French. Then he continued down the street, turned left at the corner, and disappeared into the crowd. Eli left money on the table and followed. He stayed back far enough to avoid detection, but close enough not to lose visual contact. This was insane. He had no backup, no weapons, no authorization to operate on French soil, no plan whatsoever. He was just a burned-out intelligence officer on vacation who'd stumbled onto the target he'd been obsessing over for more than a decade. Al-Rashid walked 4 blocks, then entered a small hotel near the Seine. Not a luxury property, but nice, mid-range, the kind of place a businessman might choose. Eli watched from across the street, memorizing details. The hotel name, the entrance, the sightlines, the foot traffic patterns. He couldn't go inside without risking exposure. If Al-Rashid saw him, if there was any recognition, the target would vanish again, maybe forever this time. Eli found a café with a direct view of the hotel entrance and ordered coffee he didn't drink. He sat there for 4 hours, watching. Al-Rashid didn't emerge. As evening approached and the Paris streetlights flickered on, Eli finally allowed himself to process what had just happened. 12 years of hunting through intelligence reports and intercepted communications and informant networks. 12 years of missed leads and cold trails and targets who disappeared like smoke. And now, by pure chance, Eli had found him. The question was what he did next. To understand why Eli Cohen spent 12 years hunting one man, you have to go back to where it started. May 15, 1978, Ma'alot, a small town in northern Israel near the Lebanese border. Eli was 26 years old, fresh into Mossad after 4 years in military intelligence. He was an analyst, not a field operative. His job was reading reports, identifying patterns, connecting dots that other people missed. It was careful work, meticulous, the kind of intelligence work that happened in quiet offices rather than dramatic operations. On that day in May, Eli was at headquarters in Tel Aviv when news of the attack came through. Palestinian terrorists had infiltrated from Lebanon, taken over a school, and held 115 people hostage, mostly children. The standoff lasted hours. Israeli special forces attempted a rescue. The terrorists started executing hostages. When it was over, 25 people were dead. 22 of them were children between the ages of 14 and 16. The photographs came through intelligence channels within hours. Eli saw them all. He saw what bullets did to children. He saw the classroom where it happened, the walls marked with blood and bullet holes. He saw the faces of parents who'd sent their kids to school that morning and would never see them alive again. This wasn't Eli's first exposure to violence. He'd served in the Yom Kippur War. He'd seen combat. He'd seen death. But there was something about this attack, something about the deliberate targeting of children that cut through all the professional detachment he'd built up. This wasn't war. This wasn't soldiers fighting soldiers. This was murder, systematic, intentional, designed to cause maximum psychological damage to Israeli society. In the days after the massacre, intelligence poured in from multiple sources. Shin Bet interrogated one terrorist who'd survived the raid. The Lebanese informant network reported on chatter about the operation. Signals intelligence intercepted communications between Palestinian groups discussing what had happened. And one name kept appearing in the reports: Mahmoud al-Rashid. He hadn't been at Ma'alat physically. He wasn't one of the terrorists who'd taken over the school. But according to multiple sources, he'd been the operational commander who'd planned the attack. He'd selected the target. He'd recruited the team. He'd coordinated the logistics that got them across the border. He'd given the final authorization for an operation specifically designed to kill as many Israeli children as possible. Al-Rashid was described in the intelligence reports as a rising figure in the Democratic Front for the Liberation of Palestine. 34 years old, university educated, fluent in Arabic, French, and English. He'd been a professor of literature in Beirut before joining the DFLP. Now he was running operations from Lebanon, planning attacks that were increasingly sophisticated and increasingly brutal. Eli compiled everything they knew about al-Rashid into a target file: birth date, family background, education, known associates, previous operations he'd been connected to, patterns of movement, security protocols. It was standard analytical work. But as Eli built the file, as he assembled the pieces of this man's life and career, something changed inside him. This wasn't just another target anymore. This was the person responsible for those photographs, for those 22 dead children, for the parents who'd never recover from what happened. Eli wanted al-Rashid found. He wanted him captured or killed. He wanted justice for what had been done. That's when the obsession began. Eli didn't realize it at the time. He thought he was just doing his job thoroughly, paying extra attention to an important target. But looking back years later, he'd recognize this moment as the beginning of something that would consume 12 years of his life and cost him almost everything he cared about. Who was Mahmoud al-Rashid? That became Eli's obsession in the months following Ma'alat. Understanding your enemy was fundamental to intelligence work. You couldn't predict someone's movements, anticipate their decisions, or find their vulnerabilities without understanding who they actually were beneath the operational profile. So Eli dug deeper. He went beyond the basic biographical data that appeared in the initial target file. He tracked down people who'd known al-Rashid before he became a terrorist. He read everything al-Rashid had published during his academic career. He built a psychological profile that tried to understand how a literature professor became someone who planned massacres of children. What Eli discovered was complicated. Al-Rashid wasn't some ignorant fanatic driven by religious extremism. He was educated, sophisticated, cultured. He'd studied at the American University of Beirut, one of the most prestigious institutions in the Middle East. He'd written his doctoral dissertation on French existentialist literature. He'd taught undergraduate courses on Camus and Sartre. His students remembered him as brilliant, passionate, someone who could make 19th century novels feel urgently relevant to modern life. He'd been married young, had 2 daughters, lived a comfortable middle-class existence in Beirut's Christian quarter, where Muslims and Christians lived side by side in relative harmony. Then came 1970, Black September. The Jordanian army's crackdown on Palestinian groups operating from Jordan. Thousands of Palestinians were killed. The PLO was driven out of Jordan and relocated to Lebanon. Al-Rashid's family had originally been from Haifa, displaced in 1948 when Israel was established. Like hundreds of thousands of other Palestinians, they'd ended up in refugee camps, eventually making their way to Jordan and then Lebanon. According to intelligence Eli gathered from interviews with former colleagues, Al-Rashid had never been particularly political before Black September. He was more interested in literature than liberation movements. But something changed after 1970. Maybe it was seeing fellow Palestinians massacred by an Arab king. Maybe it was the realization that Palestinians had no real allies, no country that would actually protect them. Maybe it was guilt that he'd been living comfortably while his people suffered. Whatever the reason, Al-Rashid started attending DFLP meetings, started writing articles for Palestinian publications, started moving away from academic life toward political activism. By 1972, he'd stopped teaching. By 1974, he'd joined the DFLP's military wing. By 1976, he was planning operations. His first documented operation was a bombing of an Israeli military convoy near the Lebanese border. 3 soldiers killed. Then an attack on a kibbutz that left 5 civilians dead. Then the operation that would make him infamous in Israeli intelligence circles, a bombing of a bus in Jerusalem that killed 11 people and wounded dozens more. Each operation was more ambitious than the last. More casualties, more psychological impact. Al-Rashid developed a reputation within the DFLP as someone who combined intellectual sophistication with operational ruthlessness. He could analyze targets with academic precision and plan attacks with cold efficiency. And he had no moral boundaries about who got killed. Soldiers, civilians, children, it didn't matter. In his view, all Israelis were legitimate targets in a war for Palestinian liberation. Understanding this made Eli's pursuit more complicated. Al-Rashid wasn't just evil. He was intelligent evil, educated evil, evil that could articulate sophisticated justifications for murdering children. That made him more dangerous than a simple fanatic. It also made him harder to catch because he thought like an analyst, anticipated surveillance, understood intelligence methodology. He was, in a very real sense, Eli's dark mirror. Both were intellectuals who'd chosen intelligence work. Both were meticulous planners. Both were obsessed with their respective causes. The difference was that Eli worked within moral and legal frameworks, however imperfect, while Al-Rashid had abandoned any constraints in pursuit of his goals. 1982, Beirut, Lebanon. After 4 years of tracking Al-Rashid through intelligence reports and second-hand information, Eli finally got his chance. Israel launched Operation Peace for Galilee, the invasion of Lebanon designed to drive the PLO out of the country and stop cross-border attacks. Israeli forces moved into southern Lebanon and eventually surrounded Beirut. For Mossad, this created unprecedented opportunities. Suddenly, they had access to territory that had been completely denied to them. They could operate openly. They could gather intelligence that had been impossible to collect from outside Lebanon, and they could go after targets who'd been safely protected by distance and hostile territory. Eli saw the invasion as his opportunity to finally get Al-Rashid. He requested permission to deploy to Lebanon with a team specifically tasked with locating and capturing high-value PLO targets. His superiors were initially reluctant. Eli was an analyst, not a field operative. He had minimal operational experience, but Eli argued that he knew more about al-Rashid than anyone else in Mossad. He'd spent 4 years studying this target. He understood al-Rashid's patterns, his psychology, his network. Nobody else had that depth of knowledge. Eventually, they approved his request with conditions. He'd work with an experienced field team. He'd follow operational protocols. He wouldn't take unnecessary risks. Eli agreed to everything. He didn't care about the restrictions. He just wanted to be on the ground, actively hunting instead of analyzing from a distance. The team deployed to Beirut in late June. The city was under siege. Israeli forces controlled the outskirts. The PLO controlled the center. Civilians were trapped in between. It was chaos. Buildings destroyed by artillery, streets blocked by rubble, thousands of people trying to flee or hide. And somewhere in this chaos was al-Rashid. Eli's team set up in a building that had been evacuated, establishing a forward operating base where they could coordinate intelligence collection and plan operations. They had informants throughout Beirut, Palestinians who were willing to provide information in exchange for money or protection or promises of safe passage out of Lebanon. Within the first week, they got a lead. One informant reported that al-Rashid was hiding in an apartment building in West Beirut, in an area still controlled by Palestinian forces. The informant provided an address, a description of the building, details about al-Rashid's security setup. According to the source, al-Rashid had 2 bodyguards. He rarely left the apartment. He was waiting for orders about whether to evacuate with other PLO leadership or stay behind and continue operations underground. The intelligence seemed solid. The informant had been reliable in the past. The team verified what they could through surveillance. The building matched the description. There were armed guards outside. People came and went who matched profiles of known DFLP members. Eli wanted to move immediately. His team leader, a veteran operative named Yosef, was more cautious. They needed better confirmation. They needed to actually see al-Rashid. They needed escape routes planned. They needed to coordinate with Israeli military units in the area in case the operation went wrong, and they needed extraction under fire. Eli argued that delay risked losing the target. Al-Rashid could evacuate. He could move to a different safe house. He could slip away like he'd done dozens of times before. But Yosef insisted on proper planning. This wasn't some revenge mission. This was a professional intelligence operation. They'd do it right or not at all. They spent 3 days preparing. Surveillance confirmed multiple people were in the apartment. The building layout was mapped. Approach routes were planned. Coordination was established with Israeli forces. Everything was ready. On the morning they were set to execute the operation, a Palestinian teenager walked out of the apartment building carrying a suitcase. The team watched him through binoculars. He looked nervous. He kept checking behind him. He walked 6 blocks to a taxi stand, got into a car, and disappeared into the city. Something felt wrong. Yosef made the decision to send scouts to check the apartment before committing the full team. 2 operatives approached undercover as civilians. They entered the building. They climbed to the 3rd floor. The apartment door was unlocked. Inside, the apartment was empty. Not just empty of people, empty of everything. Furniture was gone. Personal belongings were gone. Even the trash had been removed. Al-Rashid had evacuated at least 48 hours earlier, maybe longer. The teenager with the suitcase was probably the last person out, removing final evidence. The operation was over before it began. 1985. 3 years after the failed Beirut operation, Eli sat in an empty apartment in Tel Aviv, staring at photographs spread across his kitchen table. Not family photos, not vacation memories. Intelligence photographs of Mahmoud al-Rashid, taken from various sources over the past 7 years. Al-Rashid in Beirut before the invasion. Al-Rashid caught on surveillance cameras in Damascus. Grainy images from informant networks showing Al-Rashid meeting with other Palestinian leaders in Tunisia. Eli knew these photographs better than he knew his own reflection. He could identify Al-Rashid from the smallest details, the way he walked, the way he held a cigarette, the slight asymmetry in his face from a broken nose that had healed poorly years ago. But knowing what Al-Rashid looked like didn't help find him. After the Beirut failure, Al-Rashid had gone completely dark. The intelligence suggested he'd evacuated to Syria along with other PLO leadership when Israeli forces finally pushed them out of Lebanon. But confirmed sightings became increasingly rare. Al-Rashid had learned from his close call. He moved constantly. He trusted fewer people. He communicated through cutouts and intermediaries. He became, in intelligence terminology, a hard target, someone who understood surveillance and took sophisticated countermeasures to avoid it. Eli's marriage had fallen apart 6 months earlier. His wife, Rachel, had finally had enough. Enough of the missed dinners and forgotten anniversaries. Enough of waking up at 3 a.m. to find Eli at the kitchen table reading intelligence reports. Enough of the obsession that consumed everything else in his life. She'd tried to be understanding. She knew what Eli did was important. She knew the work Mossad did protected Israeli lives. But she also knew that Eli's pursuit of Al-Rashid had gone beyond professional duty into something personal and destructive. She'd asked him directly one night, why this target? Why this specific person when there were hundreds of terrorists Mossad was tracking? What made Al-Rashid different? Eli had tried to explain the Ma'alot massacre, the 22 dead children, the photographs he couldn't forget. But Rachel pointed out that Eli hadn't known any of those children, hadn't known their families. He was using their deaths to justify an obsession that had nothing to do with them anymore, and everything to do with his own need to prove he could catch someone who kept escaping. She'd filed for divorce in January. By March, she'd moved out. Their daughter, 10 years old, barely knew him anymore. When he had visitation weekends, she was polite but distant. She called him Eli instead of Abba, the Hebrew word for father. She didn't tell him about school or friends or the things happening in her life. She treated him like a stranger who happened to share her last name. Mossad had also started pulling back. Eli's superiors wanted him to move on to other targets. Al-Rashid was important, but he wasn't the only terrorist they were tracking. Resources were limited. The obsessive focus on one target wasn't justified anymore, especially when that target had been quiet for almost 3 years with no confirmed attacks. Eli argued that quiet didn't mean inactive. It meant Al-Rashid was planning something, building networks, preparing for operations. They needed to find him before he struck again, but his arguments fell on increasingly skeptical ears. Finally, his division chief called him in for a meeting and told him directly, "Move on, take new assignments, let other analysts track Al-Rashid. You're too close to this, you've lost perspective." Eli nodded and agreed. Then he went back to his desk and continued working on Al-Rashid. He started using his vacation time to pursue leads Mossad wouldn't authorize. He spent his own money traveling to meet informants. He called in personal favors with intelligence contacts in other countries. The line between justice and revenge had blurred so completely that Eli couldn't tell the difference anymore. He just knew he couldn't stop. 1987. 2 years of working Al-Rashid on his own time, using methods Mossad wouldn't officially approve. Eli had built something remarkable, a network of informants across Damascus who could track movement, monitor communications, and gather intelligence on Palestinian groups operating from Syria. It wasn't official Mossad network. It was Eli's personal creation, funded with his own savings and money he borrowed from friends who didn't ask too many questions about why he needed it. The network started small. A Palestinian shopkeeper who'd lost family members in a Black September crackdown and had no love for the organizations that claimed to represent his people. A Syrian government clerk who needed money for his son's medical treatment. A taxi driver who worked routes between Damascus neighborhoods where Palestinian groups maintained safe houses. Each source led to another source. Each piece of information connected to other pieces. Gradually, Eli assembled a picture of how Palestinian groups operated in Damascus, their meeting locations, their communication methods, their security protocols, and eventually his network picked up traces of al-Rashid. He was in Damascus, not permanently, but regularly. He maintained an apartment in the Yarmouk refugee camp on the city's south side. He traveled under false identity documents. He met with other DFLP leadership to coordinate operations. He was still active, still planning, still dangerous. Eli's sources provided details that official Mossad intelligence hadn't captured. Al-Rashid's daily patterns. He didn't trust phones or electronic communications. He met people face to face in locations that changed constantly. He traveled with minimal security now, having learned that bodyguards drew attention. He'd grown a beard, gained weight, changed his appearance enough that casual surveillance might miss him. But there was one pattern his security couldn't hide. Every 6 weeks, al-Rashid visited his mother. She lived in a small apartment in Damascus proper, outside the refugee camp. She was elderly, in poor health, essentially housebound. Al-Rashid would arrive in the evening, stay for several hours, then leave before dawn. He brought her groceries, medicine, money. He was, despite everything else, a devoted son. This was the vulnerability Eli had been searching for, a predictable pattern, a location that could be surveilled, a connection that al-Rashid wouldn't abandon no matter how dangerous it became. But exploiting this vulnerability meant doing something Eli had sworn he'd never do, targeting a civilian, an elderly woman who'd committed no crimes, planned no attacks, hurt no one. Using her as bait to catch her son. Every principle Eli had been trained on said this was wrong. Mossad had strict rules about civilian casualties. You didn't target families. You didn't use innocent people as leverage. Operations had to minimize collateral damage, not deliberately create it. But Eli had gone too far to stop now. 7 years of hunting. 7 years of failures and near misses. 7 years watching al-Rashid escape while the bodies from his operations piled up. There'd been another attack 6 months earlier, a car bomb in Jerusalem that killed 8 people. Intelligence confirmed al-Rashid had planned it. He was still operational, still killing, still escaping justice. Eli justified it to himself. He wouldn't hurt the mother. He'd just use her apartment as a surveillance point. He'd wait until al-Rashid visited, then track him when he left. Simple surveillance. But even as he told himself this, Eli knew he was lying. If the surveillance was compromised, if al-Rashid detected it, if the operation went wrong, the mother could easily become collateral damage. Eli set up the surveillance anyway. He rented an apartment across the street from where al-Rashid's mother lived. He positioned cameras. He waited for al-Rashid's next visit. And when it came, when Eli watched through binoculars as al-Rashid helped his elderly mother from her chair to the dinner table, he understood something about himself he'd been avoiding for years. He'd become exactly what he was hunting. Someone willing to compromise any principle, cross any line, hurt anyone necessary to achieve his objective. The only difference was the cause. He told himself justified it. 1989, Rome, Italy. Eli finally had everything aligned. Solid intelligence, proper authorization, a professional team, resources. This was supposed to be the operation that ended the 12-year hunt. The intelligence came through official channels this time, not Eli's personal network. Italian security services had intercepted communications suggesting a major PLO meeting in Rome. High-level representatives from multiple factions would attend. And according to signals intelligence, Mahmoud al-Rashid would be there representing the DFLP. The meeting was scheduled for a villa outside Rome, owned by a wealthy Palestinian businessman with connections to multiple liberation organizations. Italian authorities were monitoring the location but hadn't planned to intervene. Italy maintained complicated relationships with Palestinian groups, sometimes tolerating their presence as long as they didn't conduct operations on Italian soil. But when Israeli intelligence requested cooperation, pointing out that several attendees were wanted for attacks that killed European citizens as well as Israelis, the Italians agreed to coordinate. They'd allow Mossad to conduct a surveillance operation. If the opportunity arose for capture, Italian forces would provide support. It was the kind of international cooperation that rarely happened, the kind of opportunity that doesn't come twice. Eli flew to Rome with a 6-person team. They had diplomatic cover through the Israeli embassy. They had equipment provided by Italian intelligence. They had 3 vehicles positioned for mobile surveillance. They had eyes on the villa 24 hours before the meeting. Everything was professional. Everything was coordinated. Everything followed proper operational protocols. The meeting was scheduled to start at 8 in the evening on a Thursday. Attendees would arrive throughout the day. Al-Rashid's flight from Damascus was tracked. He landed at Rome's airport at 2 in the afternoon. Italian airport security identified him using facial recognition, though he was traveling under a Jordanian passport with a false name. He took a taxi to a hotel near the Spanish Steps. Surveillance teams followed. He checked in, went to his room, and stayed there for 3 hours. At 6 in the evening, Al-Rashid left the hotel. He took another taxi toward the villa, where the meeting would occur. Everything was proceeding exactly as the intelligence predicted. Eli's team was positioned in 2 locations. One group would maintain surveillance on the villa. The other would follow Al-Rashid when he left, tracking him back to wherever he was staying, potentially creating an opportunity for quiet capture away from other Palestinian security. The plan was sound. The execution was flawless. And then, at 6:45, 15 minutes before Al-Rashid would have arrived at the villa, Italian police raided the location. Multiple vehicles, armed officers, media cameras capturing everything for the evening news. The raid was aggressive and public, a complete contrast to the quiet surveillance operation that had been agreed upon. Eli watched in disbelief as Italian police arrested everyone at the villa. Palestinian representatives were taken into custody. The entire meeting was shut down, and Al-Rashid's taxi, approaching the villa, turned around when the driver saw police activity ahead. The target disappeared back into Rome's traffic. Eli immediately contacted the Italian intelligence liaison who'd been coordinating the operation. What happened? Why did the raid occur early? The Italian officer seemed confused. He said the raid was ordered by a different division. There'd been a miscommunication. Someone higher up had decided to take direct action rather than just surveillance. Political pressure, media considerations. The explanation didn't make sense. Operations don't get changed at the last minute by accident. Communications don't break down that completely by coincidence. Eli started to suspect something that made everything worse. There might be a mole, someone who'd compromised the operation deliberately, someone who'd ensured Al-Rashid would be warned before walking into a trap. The Rome failure broke something in Eli, not his determination. That remained intact, maybe even strengthened by another disappointment. What broke was his faith in the system, in official operations, in the idea that following proper channels and protocols would eventually lead to success. He returned to Tel Aviv convinced that someone had sabotaged the Rome operation. He couldn't prove it. He had no evidence beyond the suspicious timing and the inexplicable miscommunication that warned Al-Rashid away from the villa. But his instincts told him the failure wasn't accidental. Mossad investigated internally. They found nothing conclusive. The Italian explanation about bureaucratic confusion was plausible, however frustrating. These things happened in joint operations. Different agencies had different priorities. Communications broke down. It didn't have to be sabotage. It could just be incompetence. But Eli stopped trusting large, coordinated operations after Rome. He went back to working alone, back to his personal network of informants, back to the methods that couldn't be compromised because nobody knew about them except him. His superiors had mostly given up trying to redirect him. Eli had become the office obsessive, the analyst who'd lost perspective. People talked about him in sympathetic tones. Poor Eli, still chasing the target who got away, doesn't know when to quit, can't let go. By late 1990, Eli was exhausted. 12 years of hunting, 12 years of near misses and failures, 12 years that had cost him his marriage, his relationship with his daughter, most of his friendships, and nearly all of his savings. He was 42 years old and had nothing to show for the last decade, except files full of intelligence on a target he'd never caught. That's when Mossad ordered him to take vacation. Not suggested, ordered. His handler sat him down and said directly that Eli was burned out. He needed rest. He needed perspective. He needed to be somewhere other than an office staring at photographs of Mahmoud al-Rashid. 2 weeks minimum. Somewhere far from Israel and the Middle East. Somewhere he could pretend to be a normal person for a little while. Eli chose Paris almost randomly. He'd never been there. It seemed pleasant. It was definitely far from anything related to his work. He booked a hotel, packed a small bag, and flew to France with no agenda, except trying to remember what life felt like when you weren't obsessed with hunting someone. The first few days were strange. He walked around the city like a tourist. He visited museums. He sat in cafes drinking coffee and watching people. He tried to read books that had nothing to do with intelligence or terrorism or the Middle East. It almost worked. He almost started to relax. Then came October 18th, the afternoon when Eli sat at a café on Rue de Rivoli watching a street performer juggle fire. The moment when 12 years of hunting ended, not through careful planning or brilliant intelligence work, but through pure chance. Mahmoud al-Rashid walking past on a Paris street, looking like a businessman on vacation. The 12-year hunt came down to that moment. Everything Eli had sacrificed, everything he'd lost, every failure and near miss, all of it led to this absurd coincidence. Being in the right cafe at the right time in a city he'd chosen almost randomly for a vacation he hadn't wanted to take. Eli followed al-Rashid to the hotel near the Seine. He set up surveillance from the cafe across the street. He watched for hours as evening fell and the Paris streetlights came on, and he realized he had no idea what to do next. He had no backup, no authorization, no weapons, no plan. He was just one burned-out intelligence officer sitting alone in a foreign city, watching the target he'd spent 12 years hunting. The target who was completely unaware that Eli existed, who had no idea that this random stranger in a Paris cafe had sacrificed everything to find him. The disconnect was almost funny. Al-Rashid was probably in his hotel room relaxing, maybe reading, maybe making phone calls, maybe planning his next operation, completely safe, completely unaware, while Eli sat across the street facing the biggest decision of his life. For 3 days, Eli followed Mahmoud al-Rashid through Paris. Not close surveillance, not the kind of aggressive tracking that risked exposure, just patient observation from a distance, learning patterns, understanding routine, watching for vulnerabilities. Al-Rashid maintained a surprisingly predictable schedule. He left his hotel every morning at 9. He walked to a different cafe each day for breakfast. He spent afternoons visiting museums and bookstores. He ate dinner alone at small restaurants. He returned to his hotel by 10 each evening. There was no security, no bodyguards, no counter-surveillance. Al-Rashid moved through Paris like any other tourist, like someone who felt completely safe, like someone who'd forgotten that he was one of the most wanted men in Israeli intelligence files. Or maybe he just believed he'd won. That after 12 years of successfully evading capture, he was untouchable. That Israeli intelligence had given up. That he could relax in a European city without constantly looking over his shoulder. Watching him was surreal. Eli had spent 12 years imagining this moment. 12 years building al-Rashid into something mythological in his mind. A brilliant adversary. A ghost who could disappear whenever capture seemed imminent. A target so sophisticated that normal intelligence methods couldn't touch him. But the man Eli watched in Paris wasn't mythological. He was ordinary, middle-aged, slightly overweight, going gray, reading French newspapers in cafes, browsing second-hand bookstores, looking at paintings in museums with genuine interest. He looked like a retired professor enjoying a vacation, which in a sense he was. Just a professor who'd spent the last 20 years planning operations that killed hundreds of people. On the second day, Eli called Tel Aviv. He used a secure line from the Israeli embassy. He spoke to his handler and explained the situation. He'd found al-Rashid. Confirmed visual identification. Target was in Paris, alone, vulnerable. Eli needed authorization for emergency extraction. The handler's response was immediate. Absolutely not. Paris was Allied territory. They couldn't conduct operations on French soil without permission. Requesting that permission would take weeks. It would involve diplomatic channels. It would require coordination with French intelligence. It would create complications that weren't justified for one target. Come home, the handler said. Report the sighting through proper channels. Let French authorities handle it. We'll request they monitor al-Rashid and notify us if he travels somewhere we can legally act. Eli argued. 3 days from now, al-Rashid would be gone, back to Damascus or wherever he was based. This was their chance, their only chance. 12 years of hunting and they were just going to let him walk away? The handler's voice was sympathetic but firm. Yes, that's exactly what they were going to do. Because Mossad operated within international law. Because unauthorized operations in Paris could destroy relationships with French intelligence. Because one terrorist, however important, wasn't worth the diplomatic crisis that would result from getting caught. The call ended. Eli sat in the embassy communications room, staring at the phone. He had his answer. Orders were clear. Go home. Let al-Rashid disappear again. Except that 12 years led nowhere. But Eli didn't go home. He went back to the café across from al-Rashid's hotel. He sat down. He ordered coffee. And he made a different decision. Eli followed al-Rashid back to his hotel on the third evening. He watched him enter the building, watched the lights come on in his fourth-floor window, watched the silhouette move around the room. Then Eli walked across the street and entered the hotel. He took the stairs to the fourth floor. He stood outside al-Rashid's door for a full minute, listening. Television playing softly, movement inside, normal evening sounds. Eli knocked. Footsteps approached. The door opened. Mahmoud al-Rashid stood there in casual clothes, newspaper in hand, looking mildly curious about who might be visiting. He didn't recognize Eli. Why would he? They'd never met. Eli was just another stranger, just another face that meant nothing. Eli spoke in Arabic, simple words. I know who you are. I need to talk to you. Something changed in al-Rashid's expression. Not panic, not fear, just calculation. He was evaluating threat level, determining whether this stranger was actually dangerous or just mistaken. Eli pulled out his Mossad identification. That ended any ambiguity. Al-Rashid stepped back from the door. His hand moved toward something. Eli moved faster, pushing into the room, closing the door behind him. There was no weapon. Al-Rashid had been reaching for a phone. No bodyguards hidden in the bathroom. No escape route prepared. Just a terrorist caught completely unprepared. They sat across from each other, Eli in the room's single chair, al-Rashid on the bed, the television still playing, a French game show with canned laughter, Surreal background noise for a confrontation 12 years in the making. Eli explained who he was, how long he'd been hunting, what al-Rashid had cost him, marriage, daughter, career, everything sacrificed chasing a man who was now sitting 3 meters away looking tired and old. Al-Rashid listened without interrupting. When Eli finished, al-Rashid asked a simple question. What now? You kill me, capture me, call French police? Eli didn't know. He'd gotten this far on obsession and improvisation. He had no plan for what happened after he found al-Rashid. No authorization to kill him, no ability to capture him alone, no legal standing to do anything except call authorities who would create an international incident. Then al-Rashid said something unexpected. He had information, intelligence about upcoming operations, names of operatives, details of networks across Europe. He'd give everything to Israeli intelligence, not because he'd switched sides, not because he felt remorse, but because he was tired. 20 years of running operations, 20 years of looking over his shoulder, 20 years of this life. He wanted out. He wanted protection, asylum, a deal. Eli sat there processing this offer. 12 years hunting a man who was now offering to trade everything he knew for safety. Intelligence that could save lives, prevent attacks, dismantle terrorist networks. All Eli had to do was make one phone call to Tel Aviv. But looking at al-Rashid, seeing the man behind 12 years of obsession, Eli realized something. Catching him didn't feel like justice. It felt empty, hollow. Al-Rashid wasn't the mythological adversary Eli had built him into. He was just a tired, middle-aged man who'd made terrible choices and now wanted them to stop mattering. Eli made his call to Tel Aviv. He reported the situation. He relayed al-Rashid's offer. Authorization came through within hours. A team would arrive to extract al-Rashid quietly, process his intelligence, determine his value. Eli's 12-year hunt was over. He'd succeeded. He'd found his target. He'd brought in someone who could provide valuable intelligence. But sitting in that Paris hotel room waiting for the extraction team, watching al-Rashid smoke cigarettes and stare out the window, Eli understood the real cost of his obsession. He hadn't been hunting al-Rashid for 12 years. He'd been running from himself, from grief, from helplessness, from the photographs of dead children he couldn't save. Al-Rashid had just been the excuse.